My name is Kennedy, and the day my life split along a quiet seam began with the metallic clink of a key dropping into my palm. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and colder rain. Outside, a gray veil drizzled over the city. Inside, time had paused itself into heavy books and a clock that ticked with the primness of a parson. I sat perfectly still, the way I had taught myself to sit during the last years of my marriage, hands folded, shoulders squared. A woman who learned that dignity kept its own kind of company. Mr. Delaney included a separate letter regarding the farm, the lawyer said. He was a patient man with the weary politeness of a surgeon who had worked too long past midnight. He handed me an envelope with my name written in my husband's careful block letters. The handwriting looked like a fence he had built around his thoughts. I didn't open it. Not then. I only stared at the key that rested on my palm, heavier than any ring I'd worn, colder than the marble vases Frank had purchased in distant cities and placed on mantels, like trophies of silence. I wanted to ask the lawyer if he had ever seen a woman unstitched by a single silver shape. I didn't. I nodded, like a student who had just been assigned a lesson. The farm. For 22 years of marriage, it had existed to me as an address, part myth, part threat, a fixed star in the constellation of things I was not allowed to touch. He visited it monthly. He kept a separate set of boots in the trunk, a thermos that smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, and a wool coat with burrs caught in the weave. When I asked once, early on, what he grew there, he smiled a thin, elegant line. Time, he said, and distance. He would kiss my forehead the way one might close a book, and then he would go. And when he came back, he brought the forest's cologne, and a quiet that sharpened the edges of our furniture. He forbade me from visiting in the same tone. He asked me to pass the salt. Not a threat, a boundary. You won't like it, he said. It's wild. It's mine. Sometimes the word mine can be said with tenderness. He didn't say it that way. And so the farm became a legend, like a house in a novel where a woman, drawn by a draft under a door she can't see, always ends up opening the wrong room. Frank's death arrived like a dropped plate, all at once. A shatter followed by stunned stillness. One moment he was making a list at the Kitchen Island Feed Company dinner next Friday. Call the electrician about the hall light. Farm on Saturday. And the next moment, he was a phone call from a stranger who spoke in the careful tone of those whose job it is to move grief across a counter. An accident, they said. A deer, the white split second of it. The curve of the road, the long green ditch. The way metal can fold around a life with such precision you'd think it had been measured for it. A week later, we laid him into the ground. People cried appropriately. My stepdaughter kissed my cheek, barely. I arranged flowers and schedules. The house filled with the soft machinery of morning casseroles, murmurs, a revolving door of considerate footsteps. When night came, I lay in our bed and stared at the ceiling fan turning the air into slow quarters. You won't like it, I whispered to the darkness. It's wild. It's mine. The words clinked around the room like forgotten change. Now, in the lawyer's office, the key held a different temperature. I tucked it into my coat pocket with the envelope, signed the papers that turned our years into clean columns, accepted a future as serene and blank as a winter field. I drove to the farm on a Thursday because Thursdays had always belonged to errands in our marriage, and it felt appropriate to place the past into a familiar drawer. The rain had cleared. The sky looked scrubbed and blue as a new dish, the kind of weather that makes loss seem improbable. The road unfurled westward past town, past the last gas station that knew our names, past the quarry, past the dead sycamore that looked like an old witness. I had never driven this way alone. The country's smell moved in through the vents, wet hay and river and soil. The breath of places where people don't talk because the land speaks first. I pulled onto a gravel lane that cut through a stand of pines, a corridor of shadow and green cathedral. The mailbox at the head of the drive bore no name, only a number, black on rust. Frank had said anonymity was a kind of courtesy. I had disagreed quietly and then learned to leave my disagreements like seeds on a windowsill, unplanted, harmless. At the end of the lane, the house stood in the glade like an ordinary secret. 2 stories, clapboard painted the yellow of old postcards. A porch sagging in a way that suggested it had promised to remain upright for 1 more season, and then for another, and then for 20 more. A windmill clicked. Fields stretched behind the house, a quilt that had learned the language of years. A barn, read the way barns pretend to be in stories, leaned back with its doors slightly open, as if mid-sigh. I parked in the circular drive and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, the way a heart ticks when it remembers it belongs to a body. Birds fussed. In the far field, a cluster of black cows lifted their heads and considered me. Hello, I said aloud, and realized it was the first thing I'd said to the place. My voice sounded like it had borrowed someone else's bravery for the afternoon. The front door key slid into the lock with the satisfaction of a final puzzle piece. The door stuck in the frame, a necessary grunt, and then the house exhaled me into its entry hall, as if I had always been standing on the threshold waiting for permission. Dust swam in the late light. The hallway smelled like cedar and soap and something faintly medicinal. I stepped across the wide planked floor that bore the scuffs of honest life. On the left, a sitting room sofa, lamp with a green shade. The clutterless dignity of a man who kept a public life even in private. On the right, a dining room with a long table set with a runner of blue ticking and a bowl of walnuts gone, leathery with age. A staircase rose before me in a pale curve, the banister polished by hands I didn't recognize. I hesitated and then said it the way a prayer might start. It's mine. Down the hall. The kitchen waited as if I had called ahead. Along the back wall, a row of windows framed the fields like paintings. A brick hearth with a blackened kettle, a wide sink that looked ready to confess. On the table, a single mug sat on a chipped saucer. Its rim had a hairline crack, the sort of flaw a person learns and loves. I touched it and then drew my hand back quickly without knowing why. A door off the kitchen opened to a pantry, another to a mudroom lined with hooks, a wooden bench, Frank's boots standing sentry-caked with a history I had never been invited to read. I reached out and steadied myself on the bench, aware of the way my pulse climbed the steps of my throat. I took out the envelope. I slid my finger under the unflinching glue. The letter inside was brief, like all the important things we left unexplored between us. Asterisk Kennedy. Asterisk it began. Asterisk if you're reading this. I've left, and the farm is yours. You always wanted truth. This is the only place I kept any. There are rooms you will open and rooms you must not. The door at the end of the upstairs hall stays locked. There's a reason. Forgive me for the fences I built. I couldn't forgive myself for taking them down. Asterisk it wasn't signed asterisk love Frank. Asterisk he had never been a man to use the obvious word when a harder one would do. He simply signed his name the way builders sign beams before the plaster hides them. A truth buried in function. I read the letter again and felt the shape of it. My husband's last request was another boundary, and yet the key to the house had been given to me. Not a map with red X, not a chain around a secret, just the quiet reminder that some doors wanted to remain themselves. I looked toward the staircase. It's mine, I said again, But the word asterisk, mine asterisk, sounded different now. It sounded like a cliff I could step off or a meadow I could cross. I took the stairs slowly, the way you move toward music you can't yet identify. The landing opened into a hallway bright with afternoon. 4 doors, 1 at each side and 2 at the far end. The letter in my pocket weighed more than the key. I moved past the first door. It opened onto a bedroom arranged with a school teacher's efficiency. Neatly made bed, quilt in earth colors, a stack of books on the nightstand. Asterisk throw. A field guide to North American birds. A guide to medicinal plants. Asterisk. The next door opened onto a study. A roll-top desk stood against the window. A globe in the corner bore the smudged fingerprints of a man who needed the world to spin when he could not. On the desk sat an old microscope, the kind you might save from an auction because it reminded you of curiosity. Beside it, labeled vials empty, clean, waiting. A small refrigerator hummed. I opened it and found nothing but cold air and a note stuck to the interior with tape. Asterisk restock Monday. Asterisk. Whose handwriting wasn't Frank's? Lighter, younger, a stroke that didn't know how to be cautious. Ray shut the door softly, as if there were sleeping animals in the corners. At the end of the hall, 2 doors waited sovereign as judges. The left-hand door was painted the same cream as the wainscoting. The right-hand door had a new brass lock and a sheen that suggested it had resisted older hands. I knew, from the letter, which one I was not to open, how small a body can become when it is listening to itself. I selected the left-hand door out of obedience and perhaps a superstition that doors reward patience. It opened into a room that made my breath gather into one luminous ache. A nursery, not the kind with cartoon elephants or mobile stars. This room had the careful, handmade fidelity of a place loved by grown hands for a child who was to be loved fiercely. A walnut crib, a rocking chair with a plaid blanket thrown over the arm, a dresser with little wooden poles shaped like acorns. On the shelf, 3 children's books leaned into one another. The window overlooked the field. A curtain stirred and fell back into a calm that felt rehearsed. The air smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil. I stepped in, and the floorboards made a tender sound as if greeting someone they knew. On the changing table sat a basket with folded cloths and a tin of sauve. I touched the tin. My hand shook. It shook with a memory. Years ago, at a charity harvest fair, Frank had stopped for too long at the booth that sold hand-carved toys. He had picked up a small wooden horse, and the way he held it, the care, the future in the curve of his palm had made my throat sting. We had never had children, once by accident, then by intention, then by silence. We had carried that silence as neatly as we carried his dry cleaning. Frank, I said into the room, the name suddenly different on my tongue. What did you keep here that you could not bear at home? On the wall, a cluster of photographs hung in a grid. I moved closer, unsteady as a woman waking through dream fog. They were black and white, and at first glance they looked like studies of the property fence lines. The creek, the stand of birch by the west field. Then my eyes caught what they had missed. In each photograph, there was a hand, just part of one, a knuckle, a wrist, the arc of a thumb. A woman's hand, I thought, though the mind can dress a shadow in any costume. The last photograph in the grid, slightly lower than the rest as if it had been added later, showed a baby's foot against a wide palm. The baby's foot was perfect in the indecent way new things are brutally tender. Balanced on its soft heel, toes curled. The palm beneath it was a man's. You can always tell a man's hand by the thickness at the base of the thumb, and the way veins write their names just under the skin. The man wore Frank's wedding ring. I didn't realize I had grabbed the rocking chair until it creaked under my weight. The room washed and rewove itself. A baby. A woman? A room kept like a shrine and yet not dusty. Not museum silent. Someone had been here recently enough to keep lavender alive in the air. I stood. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A small scuff near the baseboard. It looked like a mark from a shoe, the kind a tiny heel leaves when it slams for joy or protest. Beside it, a second scuff. Further along, a third. I traced them like breadcrumbs to the corner where the dresser sat. The wall beside the dresser was slightly lighter than the rest, rectangle-shaped, as if a piece of furniture had once lived there and then moved. When I pressed my palm against the lighter paint, the wall gave back a ghost of cold. I held my breath and pushed. The panel clicked. It wasn't a dramatic sound. It was a polite admission. The hidden door opened inward on silent hinges to reveal a narrow passage that ran behind the wall. It smelled like dust and fresh air at once, a paradox that lifted the small hairs along my arms. A bare bulb hung from a cord, and when I pulled the chain, the light came on with a grave, forgiving hum. I stepped into the passage and closed the panel behind me. It fit so perfectly that the seam vanished. The bulb lit a low gold, turning the world into an old film. The passage sloped gently downward, and after a few paces, I saw the stairs, 13 of them, steep, carved from old wood. At the bottom, another door waited. No lock, only a black iron latch. "Don't," I murmured to myself, my voice thinner now. "Don't be the woman who opens the wrong room." But the letter had already called me forward. You always wanted truth. He had written it as if I had asked for a rare disease. I lifted the latch. The door swung into a room so unexpectedly bright my eyes flooded. For a second, colors blurred into a single living thing. Then the shapes separated. Shelves, a wide worktable. A cot covered with a quilt made from fragments of men's shirts. A window that let the afternoon in as if it were a beloved relative. Plants stood everywhere, potted, clipped, labeled. Not decorators' greenery, but a collection tended with a devotion I recognized and had never received. On the far wall, photographs again, framed in the simplest pine. These required no seeking. A woman filled them, her face clear, strong-boned. The kind of beauty that improves the longer you look because it doesn't apologize. In one, she held a baby whose hair stuck up like an exclamation. In another, she laughed at something outside the frame, head tilted, a muscle lifting at the corner of her mouth that I had watched in Frank. When he was trying not to smile, my stomach cooled with a hot kind of clarity. A bassinet sat near the worktable. It was empty but not abandoned. Beside it, a stack of cloth diapers, folded into the crisp geometry of people who have learned new rituals as if sworn. A bottle warmer waited like a sentry. A teddy bear, one of the classics, with a slightly sad face as if it already knew what people do to each other, leaned patiently against the wall. "Hello," I said, and my voice did not sound like mine anymore. It sounded like history speaking through my throat. The reply came from behind a shelf where the light softens into kindness. A small coo, the kind of sound you can only make without the gravity of knowledge. I moved toward it, each step as exact as a counted bead on a rosary. Between the jars of dried herbs and the flat cases labeled with plant cuttings, a woman stepped into view. She stopped when she saw me. Her eyes were the blue of creek water over stones. She was younger than me by 20 years. She wore a green sweater and jeans with garden stains at the knees. Her hair was pulled back in a manner both practical and careless. Strands had escaped to mark her face as more human than any photograph. In her arms she held a baby, perhaps 9 months old, perhaps younger. Babies make liars of us about time. We looked at each other the way two mirrors look when someone puts them facing one another. The corridor of infinite selves. The terrible recognition that there might be no end to what we can see if we keep staring. "Who are you?" she asked, but softly, as if she had already rehearsed my arrival. I tried to say Frank's wife but the words jammed in my mouth like a door swollen in summer. "I'm Kennedy." She closed her eyes for a moment the way a person does when the pain they were braced for finally lands and, to their surprise, does not knock them down. When she looked again, her expression had settled into a dignity that felt like an inheritance. "I'm Mara," she said, "and this is Lark." She lifted the baby slightly as if introducing a sovereign. Lark blinked at me with the serene curiosity of those who have not yet learned shame. A curl had fallen into her eye. She smiled, small and catastrophic. I reached for a steadying surface and found the edge of the worktable, where a notebook lay open. The handwriting there was the same light, young script from the note in the upstairs refrigerator. The page was a day's casual record * Lark ate well. Fever down. Cuttings from the marsh rooted. Frank here at noon. Brought honey and the new book. * beside the words, a pressed sprig of plant. Pinned in place like a jeweled thought. Frank here at noon. Something girlish and furious and old rose in me like a tide. For a moment, I saw myself from the ceiling. A woman in a good coat in a bright secret room beneath a house. She did not know. Facing another woman who had learned to fold diapers perfectly. Both of us held inside the architecture of a man's arrangements. The thought was so clean it cut me. It wasn't the affair that crushed me in that instant. It was the care. Mara watched me with a kindness that did not condescend. "You didn't know," she said. It was not a question. It was a sentence pronounced with the humility of someone who understands that truth is a shape that changes depending on where you stand to look at it. "No," I said. "He kept this from me." And then, because the truth is sometimes a trickster who slips past your guard once you invite it in, I added, and I kept myself from asking. We stood inside the complicated quiet. The baby stretched her arm toward me, fingers opening and closing like an anemone greeting the tide. Without meaning to, I moved closer. Lark caught my ring finger in a damp, strong grip. It felt like being forgiven by something that had no idea what I had done. "He told me you were kind," Mara said. "He said you'd be hurt. But he said you carry hurt the way some people carry water carefully, without spilling it on the floor." The room tilted. "He talked about me all the time," she answered, and her mouth made another small muscle at the corner. "This one an elegy. I asked if you were cruel. He said, 'She is precise, and precision is misunderstood for cruelty when men want to be sloppy.'" I let out a sound that might have been a laugh if laughter had edges. We moved like planets into a new orbit. Mara offered me a chair. I sat. The baby considered me, leaned her head against Mara's collarbone, then reached again for my ring. The touch steadied me enough to see the room not as an indictment but as evidence. Evidence of love, yes. Of deception, also yes. But more than either, evidence of a choice Frank had made to build a life that wouldn't fit into one house. "He was going to tell you," Mara said after a while. "He said that. He said the farm had to stop being only his. He didn't want fences anymore. Then he died before he could be brave," I said, and the bitterness tasted like old coins. "Or he died right after he finally set the stage," she said. I lifted the letter from my pocket and read its last sentence again. "Forgive me for the fences I built. I couldn't forgive myself for taking them down." He was wrong, I said, surprising myself with the sudden steadiness in my voice. He didn't know how good forgiveness could feel. Mara watched me the way a doctor watches an X-ray. "Do you want the truth of the rest?" she asked. "Or do you want tea first?" "The truth," I said. "If it breaks me, the tea can glue me after." She nodded. The baby cooed. The wind outside rubbed itself along the siding like a cat. "All right," Mara said. "Then I'll start with the night he first brought me here." He was carrying a box of seedlings, and a fear that looked a lot like hope. He told me he'd had a wife once who wanted a child and then wanted silence instead, because silence was kinder than another failure. He told me he'd failed you. He told me he'd failed himself. And then he said maybe this place could be the apology he never learned to say. She looked at me. "Lark is his daughter," she said simply. And the word *daughter* rang in the room like a bell that gathered us both into its sound. "And mine. And maybe if you want it, she can be yours in some way that makes sense to the three of us. And to nobody else." I closed my eyes. Behind them, a dozen years of dinners, of Thursday errands, of boots in the trunk, rearranged themselves into a pattern I had not seen. When I opened my eyes, the pattern did not hurt less, but it hurt clear. "Show me everything," I said. "Start with the plants. Start with the names. Start with Lark's first word." Mara smiled, and for the first time I loved a stranger in the instant of it. She shifted the baby to her other hip and gestured toward the shelves. "These are for fever," she began. "These are for sleep. These are for memory." He liked these. She pointed to a row of small, hardy leaves. "Yerba buena." He said it tasted like afternoons he never had the courage to take. Lark leaned across the small distance between us and pressed her palm against my chest, right where my necklace lay hidden under my blouse. Her hand was warm and insistent, as if she were trying to find a heartbeat to learn by. "There," I whispered to her, and to the room, and to the woman I had been. There, from the window above the worktable, the fields gleamed. The windmill clicked, steady as a metronome marking the measure of a new song. Somewhere above us, in the house that had been Frank's and now was mine, a clock struck 4. Then the quiet returned, a quilt we might agree to share. I did not leave the bright hidden room until dusk reached through the window and placed its cool hand on my shoulder. The light did what light always does at that hour. It softened, forgave, made even the imperfect edges look deliberate. Lark fell asleep with the kind of abandoned adults write poems trying to remember. Mara tucked her into the bassinet and draped a thin muslin cloth across her belly, as if covering a candle to keep the flames steady. We moved around each other without instruction. I washed 3 small jars in the sink by the worktable, the water running with the thin metallic taste that belongs to wells and old pipes. Mara labeled envelopes and slid brittle leaves into them, the scratch of her pen a comforting insect sound in the quiet. The room felt like a chapel built for work instead of worship. We worshipped by working anyway. I should go upstairs and make the house look less like it's holding its breath, I said at last. "If you'll come with me, you can choose a room. If you want." Mara's eyes flickered to the ceiling, as if she could see through floorboards, to the nursery we had passed, to the hallway where the locked door waited like a thought neither of us would touch. "I can come," she said, "but I stay down here at night. Lark sleeps best to the hum of the cooler and the wind in the vent. The upstairs feels like a museum that charges admission." I nodded. "Then let's at least open the windows and let the house remember how to breathe." We climbed the narrow stairs, closing the panel carefully behind us so that the seam vanished into painted wall. The nursery looked different in evening, less like a shrine and more like a promise. I opened the window, and the fields scent floating clover, damp earth, the iron sweetness of the creek. In the study, I lifted the roll top halfway and let the desk's spine crack with a satisfied whisper. On the nightstand in the neat bedroom, I turned the books so their spines faced outward. It struck me that for years this house had been read by only one set of eyes at a time. Tonight it was being read by two at the end of the hall. The locked door soaked up the dim light. I could hear my breath in that corridor, as if the house were listening and matching the rhythm. "Frank kept this one closed?" Mara asked, her voice the careful volume one uses for museums or churches or bedrooms where grief still sleeps. "Yes." The words stood in the air like a small table between us. "His letter said to leave it. Then we will." She took a step back as if the door had bowed us both out with a courteous gesture. We went downstairs together. I lit the lamp with the green shade and, in the kitchen, set the kettle on the stove. The house answered with quiet creaks, wood settling into night's longer exhale. When the kettle sang, we poured the kind of tea that tastes mostly like hot water until you hold the cup with both hands and realize the warmth is the point. "He taught me the names of clouds in here," I said, surprising myself. I hadn't known the memory would come until it was already standing beside me. "Not in this house. In ours. Cumulus like bread rising. Cirrus like your grandmother's hairpin scratch. Cumulonimbus like a sermon no one asked for." Mara smiled into her cup. "He told me thunder was the sky rearranging its furniture." We drank. The tea cooled and tasted suddenly like the field's edge right after a tractor passes. I took the letter from my pocket once more and slid it across the table. Mara didn't touch it. She looked at it and then looked at me the way you look at a road before you decide to walk it. "We should decide what to do," I said. "Not tonight, but we should decide." The sentence felt practical and impossible at once. There's the legal truth of everything, and then there's the kind that matters. "The kind that keeps the baby fed," she said, not unkindly. "That kind," I agreed outside. The cows muttered their dark lantern prayers. Somewhere near the barn, a chain clinked. The sound touched a corner of my mind and stayed there like a pin. "We need to inventory what's here," Mara added, her voice becoming brisk in a way I recognized as the body's relief at having a task. "Plants, supplies, the freezer, the generator." Frank kept seed stock like a dragon with coins. "The tinctures, some are aged. He said time does what the sun can't." "Tomorrow," I said. "We'll start tomorrow with clipboards and honesty." The word honesty slid into the room and sat down at the table with us, a shy guest with excellent posture. When I stood to wash our cups, I noticed the mug on the chipped saucer again. Up close, the hairline crack looked like a river on a map, winding, inevitable, oddly calming. I touched it with the pad of my thumb and felt the snag. A memory rose, sudden and intact. Frank breaking an egg into a pan on an early morning. His sleeve pushed back. That blue vein on his wrist like a sentence you never finished reading. I allowed the memory to stand with me at the sink without permission or apology. "I'll drive into town tomorrow after we take stock," I said. "The lawyer will need to know that the farm is not empty." The last words failed me. No noun in that sentence knew how to carry the weight. Not asterisk secret asterisk. Not asterisk family asterisk. Not asterisk betrayal asterisk. Each word came with luggage and a map I couldn't read yet. Mara nodded once, not asking for the nouns. "I can't be a ghost, Kennedy," she said quietly. "And Lark can't be a rumor. I lived as a rumor once, and it turns a person into weather. Everyone feels you, but no one sees you. You won't be weather in any house I own." The sentence surprised me with its spine. It felt like something that had been building in me for years, pressing against my ribs, waiting for a door. We moved then into smaller movements, Mara slipping back down to the bright room with the promise to wake me if Lark woke crying. Me opening the hall closet and measuring blankets by the sense of them instead of size. I made the guest bed in the neat bedroom like a trial of how it might feel to make a bed for someone who was not a memory. When I lay down, the mattress answered like a polite stranger. Sleep came the way dusk had gently, then all at once. I woke before the light learned to be morning. The air in the house felt cooled and poised, like a word on a tongue. I put on Frank's old wool sweater I found draped over a chair in the study, and it hung on me, like a story borrowed from the wrong narrator. I did not remove it. Downstairs, I brewed coffee. The smell traveled like a friendly rumor. In the mudroom, I found a pair of boots that did not belong to Frank and did not belong to me. Women's boots, scuffed but oiled, with a dab of dried clay near the heel. Something steadied in me at the sight, proof that the world exists whether or not it is told. I stepped out onto the porch with my cup and let the morning comb its fingers through my hair. The field had pulled on a veil of mist. The windmill kept time for a song I couldn't quite hear. Across the yard, the barn's doors stood half open like a mouth trying to decide whether to speak or chew. The chain clinked again. I set the cup on the porch rail and walked toward the sound. My boots found the damp places. The earth gave a little and then forgave me. The barn had to aisles, the left stacked orderly with hay bales and tools. The right shadowed and deep. The chain sound came from that shaded aisle. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the source, a sturdy dog, mottled brown and white, tethered but with enough line to move, lying with his head on his paws as if all nights of all summers had looked like this one. "Hello," I said, and the dog lifted his head slowly, not surprised. Just interested in whether I would prove myself. His eyes were old amber, the color of medicine bottles. He stood, yawned a hinge yawn that exposed a pink tongue, and thumped his tail once against a post. I bent to read the brass nameplate on his collar. *Huckleberry, *Huckleberry, I said. "Who's been feeding you?" He gazed at me with a steadiness that did not flatter or beg. I found a bucket, filled it from the pump, and he drank as if he were doing me a courtesy. When he finished, he placed his head against my knee for a moment like a benediction, and then returned to his place. Satisfied that introductions had been properly made, I checked the grain bins, the tractor, the row of old glass jars on a shelf that held nails of various sizes in a taxonomy. Frank had always respected. Everything wore a thin film of neglect, but nothing felt abandoned. This was the difference I was learning. Neglected things asked to be noticed and tended. Abandoned things learned to speak in past tense. The farm hadn't forgotten how to conjugate itself in the present. When I returned to the house, Mara was in the kitchen with her hair damp, Lark on her hip, and a smile that belonged to mornings that had not been earned but were accepted anyway. She had the kind of grace that arrives in practical clothing. Lark held a wooden measuring spoon and beat a soft tattoo against Mara's shoulder. "Coffee?" I asked. "Coffee?" I asked. "Please," she said. "Lark requires an audience for porridge." We moved around each other easily, again me at the stove, her at the table, Lark discovering that the world makes sounds and that she could boss some of them into happening. We ate. The porridge tasted like warmth learned to be food, the way porridge always tastes. When the bowls were rinsed and stacked, I fetched to clipboards I found in a cabinet with old seed catalogs. We began the inventory on the porch, walking the perimeter of the house first, then the sheds, then the barn. I wrote in a neat, teacherly hand, Mara in a quick script that turned letters into tracks of small birds crossing a shallow stream. At the greenhouse, a structure I hadn't registered from the drive yesterday. its glass-paneled roof pebbled with dew. We paused. Inside, the air was a different season. Tomato vines spiraled upward with the kind of optimism that embarrasses some men. Basil breathed aggressively. A vine I couldn't name offered shy star-shaped blossoms from under a leaf's green palm. Frank dug this with his own hands, Mara said. He was proud of blisters when they had a thesis. I placed my palm against one of the glass panes and felt heat soak the lines, as if reading my future. He never brought me here, I said. The sentence was simple, but to my surprise, it didn't fall like a complaint. It settled like a fact we could set a jar upon without wobble. Then we will bring you here now, Mara answered, as if the verb *bring* had never needed Frank to conjugate it for us. By noon, our clipboards looked like moderate novels, lists of tools and oils, of irrigations in need of violet replacements, of jars half full, of books to be returned to the shelf after we checked for notes in the margins. Huckleberry followed us at the measured distance of an usher. Every so often, Lark shouted a vowel that sounded like a surprised bird, and we stopped to grin at her because adoration is a duty when babies are new. When the sun slipped its coin to the other side of the sky, we returned to the kitchen. I fried eggs and sliced tomatoes. Mara tore basil leaves and arranged them in a small bowl like confessions enough for two. We ate on the back steps with our legs stretched out. The grass brushed our ankles with the immodest affection of late summer. The wind carried toward us the sound of the creek agitating its own patience around stones. There's something else, Mara said after a while, the words careful but not evasive. I didn't want to open too many boxes yesterday. Open it, I said. Frank and I weren't only together. The euphemism tasted wrong and she corrected herself at once. We worked together. The plants, the tinctures. People came to him for the old ways when the new ways made them feel like numbers. He asked me to help because I'd been my grandmother's apprentice as a girl. He said I had hands that could listen. I thought of the microscope in the study, the labeled vials, the note in the upstairs refrigerator. Is it legal? I asked, and then laughed at myself quietly. I sound like a ledger. It is, she said. Mostly. We don't promise cures. We promise comfort. But we kept records like sins anyway, in case anyone asked. Then there are people who rely on this place, I said. There are, she answered, and they'll be coming whether or not we agree on the language for what we are to each other. I watched a hawk make the sky smaller for a second. Then we should meet them on our terms. I don't want to hide. I did enough hiding in a house with more windows than secrets. Mara laughed, surprised. How many secrets? Enough to look like good taste, I said. And we both laughed then. And the sound folded the day at the corners neatly. After lunch, we went inside and spread our lists on the kitchen table. I dialed the lawyer from the landline because it felt correct to let the farm talk over wires. That remembered voices better than glass rectangles do, he answered on the third ring, his politeness clearing its throat. I told him the farm was in use. I told him there was a greenhouse and a business and a dog with a literary name. I told him there were plants and tinctures and a woman named Mara and a child named Lark. I did not offer titles for any of us. I see, he said when I had finished. Paper shuffled on his end. Mrs. Delaney, there are ways to protect everyone involved. But first, I should tell you, the pause felt like a stair missing underfoot. Tell me, I said. There is another letter, he said. For you, and one for Ms. Mara Ashe. They were in a safety deposit box separate from the will. The bank contacted me this morning because of a scheduling error on their part. I was going to call you this afternoon. Bring them, I said, or I will come. I can drive out, he said, a little too quickly. This evening, I gave him the directions. When I hung up, the phone's cradle sounded like an old book closed carefully. I looked at Mara. She looked back with eyes that understood that letters are rooms and rooms are countries. And countries sometimes go to war. We'll read them, I said. Whatever is inside, we will read it. We will, she said. We spent the late afternoon cleaning the study. I opened the roll top the rest of the way. Inside were drawers labeled with the neatness of a man who loved Latin. Asterisk herba. Radix, folium, cortex. Asterisk. I slid one open and found index cards, each filled with recipes the way grandmothers fill recipe boxes, with salvation disguised as casseroles. Frank's hand had annotated the margins with ratios and dates. In one corner of one card, a small sentence in a different hand. Asterisk. Trust the slow boil. Asterisk. This was his church, I said under my breath. Mara, dusting the globe, nodded. And we're the new clergy with a baby for a bishop. At 7, a car turned slowly up the lane. Gravel murmuring like a crowd is about to stand. We watched through the front window as the lawyer stepped out, wind folding his tie with polite efficiency. Mara took Lark, who had been dozing on my shoulder, and I opened the door before he could knock. He carried a narrow envelope case like a farmer carries a basket of eggs. In the kitchen, he placed it on the table and stood for a moment as if he had stepped into weather that didn't match his suit. It's good to meet you, Ms. Ashe, he said. I'm sorry for your loss. He said the last word plural without forcing it. Thank you, Mara said. He undid the case's clasps with steady fingers and removed the envelopes. Each had a name, mine in Frank's block letters, Mara's in the younger script I had learned to recognize the hand that labeled plant cuttings. That taped a note in the refrigerator. He had made us write our own names on our own letters. Then, I didn't know whether to be grateful or furious that he had taught us to recognize ourselves. Before he vanished, we didn't delay. Letters rot in their envelopes like fruit in crates. I broke the seal and let the paper lift its smell of ink and bank vault, and the inside of a man's chest. Asterisk Kennedy. Asterisk. It began like the first, but then it did what the first hadn't. It told a story. Asterisk. I wanted to give you a clean truth and I failed. I gave you a tidy house instead. You deserve the truth that is not tidy. Asterisk. He wrote about an autumn after our second failed attempt at making a child. How he had driven to the farm and worked until his hands blistered into clarity. How he had met Mara at the farmer's market on a Sunday when the sky behaved and humans didn't. How she had sold him herbs for sleep without promising anything but rest. How rest had and had not arrived. How grief taught him a dialect in which the only verbs were asterisk try asterisk and asterisk endure asterisk and asterisk forgive asterisk. Asterisk. I should have told you when my love changed shape. Asterisk. He wrote. Asterisk. It didn't diminish. It grew extra rooms. I added a nursery inside myself and didn't invite you to see it, because I was afraid you'd hear the floorboards complain. I was a coward of a particular breed. The kind that does not run. The kind that stands very still and hopes other people do the moving for him. Asterisk. He wrote about Lark's birth, how he had held the bassinet with the baffled reverence of a man, carrying water from a river so clean it made him doubt cities. He wrote about me, and the sentences were not excuses. They were mosaics. Asterisk. You taught me to love a kitchen light left on when the house is empty. You taught me to polish my shoes before a funeral, even if the ground is muddy. You taught me that quiet is not absence. It's an instrument that requires practice. I could not have built this other life without the shape of the first life you made with me. Asterisk. Then the end. Written as if his hand had slowed to speak properly. Asterisk. If you can Give Lark a story in which she is not a mistake. If you cannot, then give yourself a story in which you are not a failure. If you cannot do either, forgive me in the way you forgive the weather without believing it has your best interests in mind, but admitting it exists, and you must walk through it. There was no signature. I didn't need one. The room had already signed his name by the way the light arranged itself on the table. I folded the letter and set it beside the first, as if papers could escort one another. Mara held hers but hadn't opened it yet. She kissed Lark's temple, placed the baby in the bassinet near the window, and then slid her thumb under the glue. She read in silence, her face registering small weather patterns cloud cover, a gust, a little blue clearing near the horizon. When she finished, she pressed the paper to her chest for a breath length and then laid it open on the table. What did he give you? I asked, my voice level only because it knew how to behave in rooms with lawyers. A request, she said, and a confession. He asked me to tell you that he wanted you to have the farm. He asked me to stay if you would let me, and to go if you wouldn't. He confessed that he loved the version of himself he found here and did not know how to introduce him to the version he made with you. I let the words stand. They were not furniture to be moved. They were load-bearing. We make our own versions now, I said finally, and they can know one another. The lawyer cleared his throat gently. The sound of a man asking permission to return us to the law's narrow hallway. There are papers we can draw up, he said. Co-ownership, trusts, arrangements. But they will only be as good as your agreement to be the kind of people who keep promises. We can be, Mara said. I can be, I said. He left at dusk, his car taking the lane with the caution of someone who had visited a place where the air asks questions. When the house settled again, we stood in the kitchen and watched the last light push itself thin along the floorboards. Lark stirred, heaved a small heroic sigh, and went back to dreaming whatever babies dream, a life without nouns, just verbs. Reach, warm, open. We're staying, Mara said. If you'll have us, you're staying, I said, because this house needs all our names to keep from leaning too far in any direction. We cleaned the table. We placed the letters in the roll-top desk, top drawer, under folium *. We didn't lock the drawer. The unlocked felt like prayer done properly. When the moon rose, I returned to the porch with a blanket and the wool sweater and the old dog, who had decided my knee was a trustworthy altitude for his head. The fields shone as if someone had sifted sugar over the land. The windmill clicked, slow, patient tick, tock, tick, as if telling time for a new calendar. I thought of the locked door at the end of the upstairs hall and felt no tug. Not tonight. The house already had enough open rooms. Some doors ask to remain closed the way some wounds ask for the kindness of a bandage, until the skin underneath remembers itself. Huckleberry sighed the deep, barn-quiet sigh that says, you are finally sitting in the right spot. I reached down and found his ear with my palm, and we listened to the night make itself. We listened to the creek insist on passage. We listened to the baby breathe through the vent. We listened to ourselves not breaking in the morning. There would be calls to make, records to arrange, shelves to straighten, fences to mend, a community to explain. There would be people with a year's worth of aches who would knock on the door and ask for kindness in bottles. There would be scandal, perhaps, from those who require neatness as proof of goodness. There would be a study to rearrange around new truths, a greenhouse to coax through winter, a dog who would learn new hands and pretend he always trusted them. Tonight, there was a field, a windmill metronome, a baby breathing. a woman in a sweater that belonged to a man who had taught her clouds and cowardice in equal measure, and another woman downstairs learning the air of a house that would not apologize for containing more than one story. The porch boards were warm from the day and cooling into honesty. "My name is Kennedy," I said softly to the night, "because sometimes you have to say your name to believe the throat it lives in. This is my farm. This is our farm. This is where truth grows with the weeds." The night did not argue. It just kept being night, which was mercy enough. The following morning arrived clear and calm, as if the farm itself had agreed to start again. Mara brewed tea while I walked the porch, feeling the boards give under my steps like they were learning my weight anew. Lark's laughter drifted up from the kitchen, small and bright as wind chimes. The days that followed blurred into rhythm inventory, mending fences, feeding huckleberry, planting the late-season vegetables together. Letters were folded and kept, but not hidden. The farm began to breathe with two women's footsteps instead of one man's silence. The town learned. Of course, whispers came, but whispers cannot plow fields or soothe fevers. Those who came seeking tinctures and comfort still knocked. They found us both at the door, not explaining, not apologizing, only offering what Frank had promised. Now under new stewardship, one evening, as dusk stretched long, Mara and I sat by the greenhouse, Lark asleep in her arms. I said, "He thought truth would break us, but look, truth has made us a family." Mara nodded, eyes glistening in the fading light. "And Lark will grow up knowing no doors are forbidden to her." The windmill clicked steady in the distance. The fields darkened into one broad quilt, and I understood the ending Frank could never give me. Not fences, not secrets, but a place where grief and forgiveness could grow side by side. My name is Kennedy. This is my farm now. Ours. And when I opened the door that first day, I thought I lost my breath, but truly, I had only just begun to breathe.